back to my channel. So I'm carrying on reviewing Empire of Normality. I think we're on part 21 now, I think. So yeah, we're almost at the end now. Oops, don't fall down. Still. Yeah, so thank you for your comments. I will be doing a comments video. Once I've completed all of these videos on this book, I'll be doing a comments video going back over your comments. So, okay. So, in the next part of the book, Robert Chapman mentioned someone called Martha Russell. Now, Martha Russell said that capital needs a surplus population to act as a reserve army of workers. Which I've mentioned before. The reserve army. Since capitalists compete to produce, they are prone to crises of overproduction. And this pushes more people into the surplus population. And another factor is automation, which also it means that increasingly more and more people are pushed into the surplus population. But there are also periods of growth, and this requires having a surplus to draw on when needed. So, in other words, disabled people need to exist. So this is what Chapman argues. Chapman argues that it follows from that disabled people need to exist, he says, for capitalism to exist. Hence, he says, hence part of what is both produced by and sustains the system. Now that's a bit, I don't really agree with that. Like, disabled people need to exist for capitalism to exist. Really? Implying that disability is produced by capitalism, it's not. Come on, man, it's not. Disability is not produced by capitalism. Sorry, it's not. Disability exists independently of capitalism. Capitalism, of course, exploits disability and punishes disabled people because they don't. I mean, quite frankly, capitalism would actually rather disabled people don't exist, because capitalism resents having to pay. Capitalism resents the fact that some people can't work. So actually, disabled people need to exist for capitalism to exist. This idea being that capitalism needs a surplus. Yes, capitalism does need a surplus to draw upon and things like that. But it doesn't need disabled people per se to exist. Like, that surplus, most of the surplus is actually able-bodied and able-minded people. And, yeah, but anyway. I don't think disability sustains the system, and I don't think disability is produced by the system. I'm sorry, that's actually quite offensive. My disability is fucking not produced by the system. I am disabled, irrespective. I'd be disabled in cave times, I'd be disabled in a socialist utopia, I'd be disabled. That is quite offensive, and it can only come from some privileged person who clearly does not face real, proper disability, because otherwise he wouldn't say such shit. But anyway, it makes me quite pissed off. That is not the case, okay? Moving on. That just annoys me. Okay. because it's blatantly not my reality. I don't know whose reality he's saying it is, but it's not my reality. He says it's not just the case that certain environments are disabling, because, you know, he's following this very strong social model. It's not just the case that certain environments are disabling, he says. It's also that capitalist logics produce and require disablement, and that is primarily determined in relation to the needs of capital. That's just so simplistic. So simplistic. Like I said, I don't think capitalism produces disability. Disability is something kind of objective. Like, I'm not talking about like pseudo disabilities, like say being gay or like things like that, where people are discriminated against and things like that, which some people talk about as being a type of disability. I mean, you could call that a social disability, because there's nothing actually inherently harmful about being gay, but it has been historically discriminated against. But like actual real disabilities, like things that are actually impairing because of some actual abnormality, and I'm going to use that word because I don't like this neurodiversity speak, it is an abnormality, actual abnormality in the brain or whatever, I'm sorry, but I'd be disabled no matter what society we live in. The only thing that obviously, the only aspect of society which does impact me, and obviously it's a big aspect, it doesn't make me disabled, it just makes it harder to live with my disability, is not giving me the support I need. That's the only aspect of society which has a big impact on my quality of life. Society does not create my disability though. That is just so offensive, really offensive. Okay, moving on. She only mentioned someone called Adler Bolton's book, Health Communism, a Surplus Manifesto. I just wrote that down because I think I want to read it at some point, that's why I wrote it down. Adler Bolton's Health Communism, a Surplus Manifesto. And then he talks about neurodiversity at the group level. He says neurodiversity at the group level, he said, is vital for production. He says the production emerges from a neurological diversity at the group level. He says no human is capable of doing much alone or is wholly independent. He says everything we do relies on people who think differently, having produced some part of what each of us uses. Well, yes, that's true. Everyone's different, of course, like no one's going to say otherwise. I mean, that's just kind of common sense, obviously. He says, that's why I presume he's talking there about just like every single person, you know, humanity, not people with disabilities specifically, like the whole neurodiversity of the general population. He says, neurodiversity is required for capitalism to continue at all. He says, there are multiple studies, for example, there have been multiple studies, for example, one found including one person with ADHD in a group makes that group much better at creative problem solving at the group level. Okay. What type of ADHD are we talking about here? Like, ADHD is a very severe disorder, or people with just a few traits? Is that a bit offensive? God, I can't stand this trivialisation. It really pisses me off. Seriously, man. And that's quite dehumanising as well. Like, creativity is a human potential. It's got nothing to do with a disorder. I'm sorry, but it just has nothing to do with a disorder. It's part of being bloody human. Stop dehumanising us, you stupid NDMs. I can't stand it. Ugh, really annoys me. Right, next, carrying on then. It's hard to read it without getting pissed off. Try to contain myself, not get too pissed off as I'm reading it. He says, capitalism always requires surplus forms of neurodivergence ready for the cognitive requirements of tomorrow. He says, constantly needs different kinds of minds to be ready for what comes next. Yet, despite capital needing and constantly extracting from neurodivergent cognition, it simultaneously abandons neurodivergent people. Okay, so the type of person he's talking about is obviously like really, 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 really able people, not people like me. Really able people. When I'm reading this, I'm thinking, you're not talking about people like me. I feel quite excluded from this narrative because they're not talking about people like me. Capitalism has absolutely no space for people like me. It doesn't manufacture my disability. My disability is independent of capitalism, but capitalism sure hates people like me. I mean, actual capitalists, because we can't make any profit. And they see us as a drain and a burden. So, it certainly doesn't require people like me. Anyway, yeah, we're abandoned by capitalism. It says, capitalism requires neurodivergence even while devaluing it. Okay, when he says capitalism requires neurodivergence, what he means by that is capitalism requires people like Elon Musk. Essentially. People like Elon Musk, maybe people like Chris Packham, I don't think capitalism does really require Chris Packham, because Chris Packham's quite outspoken against climate change and other things that capitalism does. Maybe not Chris Packham, but people like, even though he's very able, but I don't think capitalism would like people like Chris Packham. People like Elon Musk, I've tried to think of I can't think of any others right now, but in that sense, maybe. But if you're talking about people who are like severely impaired, like people like me who are being directly excluded from this narrative, like we don't count, capitalism does not require us. So he's saying it requires neurodivergence. What he's really saying is it requires minimally impaired people who are so mild it's kind of not even a disorder. Because like people who are actually really impaired, who can't even work at all, or who can only do really jobs that don't get paid very much or that don't make a lot of profit, maybe that sort of work. Capitalism doesn't require us, I'm sorry. Probably it kind of looks down on us. And by the way, lots of autistic people who can work often work in the public sector, mainly because the public sector is more accommodating and capitalism hates the public sector. It is a fact though that lots of autistic people do work in the public sector, like the NHS and things like that, often in quite low level jobs, like clerical worker stuff, because it's well known that autistics who tend to work below their capabilities just because of the nature of the condition and stuff, and discrimination, all sorts of issues, but so maybe he's talking about those really niche, kind of really, really extremely able ones who work in science and technology and like the STEM subjects. Maybe capitalism requires those types, but they're the ones who are very minimally impacted, like often more like broader phenotypes. Certainly doesn't require people like me. He says, we have collective cognitive power. He says it could be harnessed to combat the dominant order. Okay, so basically he's talking about collective cognitive power here. But again, you have to be pretty able to be part of that collective, because a lot of really severely impaired people just don't have the energy or mental capacity to do that because they're so severely impaired. So actually, autistic people generally, like the really impaired ones, just often can't be involved in that sort of stuff just because they are so severely disabled. So what we really need is non-disabled people, like allies if you want to call them, to actually do a lot of that work for us just because of the nature of a disability. But the problem is that like a lot of these really able neurodiversity advocates who are like really, really able and maybe could do some of that collective stuff, tend to not really to have much empathy for people like me, like because they always deny like it's a disorder and stuff, which is really hurtful. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do think that we sort of need like non-disabled people to do quite a lot of the kind of collective action. We certainly need a universal income. We certainly need an end to Tory right-wing governments. And I would love to be out on the streets. I would do it in a heartbeat, but I can't because I'm too disabled. I can't. So that's what I mean. We need people who can do it to do it. But the problem is that these neurodiversity people just don't seem to do that sort of stuff. They never get out on the streets. They never campaign for universal incomes. I never hear any of them talking about universal income. Okay. So then he talks about liberal neurodiversity, and he says liberal neurodiversity focuses neurodivergent strengths, if you like, to help get more neurodivergent people into work. I hate it when they talk about neurodivergent strengths. I hate it because it's so dehumanising. We're people, and we have different strengths because we're human, and it's got nothing to do with our disorders. Okay. And then he talks about Singer's concept of an ecological society that constructs niches. He says it's still compatible with the capitalist logics. He says if capital can construct niches to help neurodivergent people into work, he says, it can then extract surplus value. When economically viable, he says when it's economically viable for expanding capitalist neuronormativity, when economically viable there's room for expanding capitalist neuronormativity to incorporate some minds. Currently, okay, sorry, I'll say it again. He says, when it's economically viable, there is room for expanding capitalist neuronormativity to incorporate some minds that are currently positioned as neurodivergent to bring them out of a surplus through environmental construction that enables their functioning. Well, I agree with that, but those people, again, are ableist of the most able of the able. He said, it will exclude those with disabilities that require more immediate support, who remain discriminated against in the surplus, segregated and controlled. Well, that's true. That's basically people like me. But I'm always going to be in surplus because I can never work, so. But yeah, that is true. He says this will only reform the pathology paradigm, making it marginally more inclusive. He says capitalism, once it reaches a period where labour requires a high level of cognitive or emotional processing, is increasingly disposed towards making us all either mentally ill or disabled. Well, that's not the case. Most people aren't mentally ill or disabled. That is really trivialising because, yeah, I'm not denying there's a societal aspect to certain types of mental illness, but the fact is, most people don't become mentally ill. You only become mentally ill if you have a vulnerability to it. There has to be a pre-existing vulnerability, and it's not the case that every single person is going to get a disability or mentally ill. That's just so stupid, and that's just not the case at all. That's really, really trivialising about yeah, because if everyone is disabled, no one's disabled, right? I mean, look around you. Most people are not fucking disabled. That is so offensive. Anyway, right, I'm going to move over to the next video now to carry on this video. So move around now.